After the huge fight she'd just been through, not to mention the all-night-long hike to get here, Sylvie was almost completely worn out. But the fact that she and her sister had just overcome a supposedly invincible opposing force gave her a lot of confidence, and she felt more than ready to deal with an army of human soldiers, no matter how many of them there were. She strode towards the city of Elgon, looking determined and aggressive, which she hoped would scare away any of the enemies in her path into submission. When she saw the army that lay in wait for her, though, she couldn't help but give a little gasp. There were truly thousands and thousands of them, and she also saw rows and rows of siege weapons, catapults, huge crossbow-like contraptions, and siege towers among the mass of troops. Still, the soldiers were no taller than her ankles, and apart from her head, she was completely clad in armor several inches thick, so she didn't slow down. When she was just a few of her giant strides away from the nearest enemy forces, she saw a dark cloud rise up from several thousands of the soldiers and sail towards her. Just in time, she realized it was a swarm of arrows, and she hastily covered her face with her hands. The great majority of the arrows impacted her body and limbs, causing her no harm at all. A couple had managed to hit her ears and get stuck in her hair, which, though irritating, didn't bother her at all much either. She lowered her hands only to see another cloud of arrows heading her way, so she simply hit her face again. Despite being unharmed, Sylvie didn't want this to continue on indefinitely, so she decided to act. She took 2 steps forward, stomping her feet down on the ground with maximum force, which actually caused quite a few enemy troops to wobble and stumble. Now the nearest ranks were just a foot, from her perspective, away from her feet. She lifted up her gigantic left steel boot and held it above the closest soldiers. "I don't want to squish anyone," she cried out, trying to sound as fierce as possible. "But if you bunch of little pipsqueaks don't surrender right now, I'm going to walk forward, and if anyone gets in my way, well, I guess I'll just have to scrape you off my boot soles later." Sylvie, of course, had no intention of actually crushing anyone to death under her boots. Killing violent, voracious, murderous ogres was one thing, but stomping helpless soldiers to death, many of whom probably didn't even want to be here and were just made to follow Argo's orders, didn't feel right to her. But she hoped that most of the enemy soldiers didn't know this, and that they believed her to be a merciless warrior giantess, capable of squishing humans as easily as most humans would step on insects. To her delight, her strategy seemed to work. At first. Many of the enemy, especially those who were standing right in front of her and over whom she towered like a titaness, did throw down their weapons and run away. A couple dozen braver, or perhaps more foolhardy, warriors charged forward and attacked her right foot with swords, spikes, and spears, all to no avail. There were still occasional bursts of arrows fired at her, but she just swatted them away like flies. She also began waving the tip of her sword, from which ogre blood was still dripping, over the frightened soldiers' heads, which scared even more of them away in retreat. The noise from thousands of voices, all clamoring and screaming and yelling orders, just sounded like an incomprehensible roar to Sylvie. The enemy was on the retreat, but they hadn't given up yet. The huge siege engines were being loaded and aimed in her direction, and for a moment, Sylvie felt a touch of fear, but she decided to stand her ground. The largest catapults launched huge boulders over the heads of the soldiers, but to the young princess, they were just pebble-sized, and they bounced off of her armored body without even hurting her. The same thing happened with the great ballista bolts that came flying at her, none of which managed to hit higher than her waist. She even caught one of the boulders that was aimed at her and threw it back, hitting the largest siege tower and instantly causing it to collapse in on itself. This was the moment the enemy seemed to realize they weren't going to win. A mass retreat began to happen, with most of the men, ignoring the desperate commands of their officers, dropping their weapons and running off, away from their giant foe. But Sylvie wasn't about to let them escape just like that. She strode around the main mass of troops, occasionally knocking a score of them or so over with the tips of her boots, though she was careful not to step on anyone, and blocked their retreat. "Running away, are we?" she said mockingly. "I don't think so, you bunch of insects. You'll all stay right where you are. Throw down all your weapons and surrender, and I'll consider sparing your lives. Otherwise..." She stamped her foot down hard as she could, causing a miniature earthquake to the frightened soldiers below. Her commands were, for the most part, instantly obeyed by most of the enemy, although a few of the commanding officers were still riding around through the fray, trying to get their troops to continue the fight. Sylvie directed her gaze at one of them, an important-looking man in a plumed helmet, carrying a rather tattered flag, who seemed to be in charge of most of the troops. She bent down on one knee and reached out her long arm, then plucked the tiny general off his horse with 2 fingers. The terrified man now lay helpless in her hand and began pleading for his life. Sylvie at first thought it might have been Prince Argo himself, but she saw from his graying hair that he was much older than she knew Argo to be. Also, from the way her sister had described him, she didn't think Argo would be the type who'd lead his men from the front lines. "Stop squirming, you little worm," she said to her tiny captive. She was actually enjoying the feeling of being able to intimidate and frighten humans for a change. "I'm guessing you're not Argo himself, are you? You're one of his underlings, am I right? Tell me where I can find your boss, then I'll let you return to your men." "I'm not telling you anything," the man cried. Sylvie had expected him to be uncooperative, so she decided to persuade him a little bit. She deftly took hold of one of his legs and began to twist it slowly, and he began to scream in pain. "I'm not letting go until you tell me where I can find Argo," she said firmly, increasing the pressure on his leg. "Tell me now, or else you'll be going to jail with 1 leg instead of 2. All right, but please let me go," the enemy commander yelled. Sylvie released him and he fell back in her palm, gasping for breath. "My lord Argo is up there, in the castle," the man said, pointing up towards Elgon's hill. "At least he was there when he ordered us to attack earlier. Please, I can't tell you any more." "All right, that's good enough, I guess," she said. She knelt down and dumped him unceremoniously on the ground. He tried to stand up, but his leg was still in great pain, and he instantly fell down. As he yelled for some of his soldiers to come and help him, Sylvie turned towards the city. She wanted nothing more than to rush up to the castle and catch Argo himself before he had a chance to escape. But she didn't know if that would be possible for her. Elgon's elaborate streets were much too narrow for her to pass safely through, unless she walked extremely carefully, but she didn't have that much time to spare either. She guessed Argo would try and flee to safety as soon as he saw that the battle wasn't going his way, which he probably already had. She was about to try to enter the city when she saw another, much smaller group of soldiers emerging from one of the gates. Sylvie was amused at the thought that there were still some humans who thought they could attempt to defeat her in battle. But then, she saw that one of the soldiers was carrying the flag from the kingdom of Vandan. These weren't enemy troops at all, but citizens and soldiers of the city that had come out to meet her. The small group, no more than 100 or so, came all the way up to her feet. She recognized one of the soldiers up the front. It was Commander Ansur, whom Valden and Lorek were always busy training with. She thought that Belena had told him and the other troops to remain behind at the castle, but they were here now. Sylvie stooped down and extended her hand to the commander, who climbed in. "Congratulations, Your Highness," he said to her. You saved us a lot of trouble in dealing with this army. We are all very grateful. Thanks. But aren't you supposed to be back in Rismark? Does Belena know you're here? No, she does not. And, with all due respect to the royal princess, she has never been in a battle like this before. I know that she just wants to protect everyone all the time, and we all appreciate her bravery. But she needs us humans more than she thinks. My men and I have managed to expel most of the few remaining troops in the city, and the last few remnants are being dealt with by your brother as we speak. What? Valden is here too? Valden is here too? Oh boy, if Belena finds out, she's going to murder him. Where is he? I'm going to have some words with him. Actually, we'd prefer if you stayed right here, Princess Sylvie. We may need your help in disarming and detaining all of these enemy troops outside the city. They are far too many men for us to handle by ourselves. But they seem to be scared stiff of you and wouldn't dare to do anything to us while you're here. Please, Your Highness, we need you here. Valden is a capable and well-trained soldier. I should know. And he has the makings of a good commander as well. Don't worry. He'll find and catch Argo, and then we'll bring that bastard to justice. He won't escape from what he's done here. Mark my words. Sylvie had half a mind to ignore the tiny commander and head off to the city again. But she realized that what he said made sense. Besides, she knew the people of Elgon were all watching her, and she decided it might be wiser to act like an adult for once. She agreed with Ansur and placed him on the ground again. This foreign army, though defeated, still had to be decisively dealt with. Ansur told her that the plan was to relieve all the enemy soldiers of their weapons and armor, then escort them to the borders of Vandan with an armed guard to release them. Only the commanders would be taken prisoner, and they too might be released if it turns out that they were merely pawns in Argo's vile scheme. Sylvie didn't have any better ideas, so she agreed to stay and help. However, she couldn't help but worry about her older brother. She hoped he would succeed in capturing Argo without getting killed in the process. She also wondered how Belena was doing at the moment as well. I'm so glad this day is almost over, she thought to herself. The worst part is done with. Or at least, I hope it is. Valden had always sort of looked forward to the day when he would get to fight in a real battle, rather than simply spending his time training with weapons and mock fighting. Now that such a day had actually arrived, however, he realized how foolish his wish had been. He had always known that being in combat would involve killing, but to actually have to resort to this method of ending a fight was repugnant to him. But as soon as he realized when they encountered the first group of enemy soldiers in the city, often it was necessary to take the enemy's life in order to preserve your own. Valden, surrounded by his own band of soldiers, always gave the enemies they encountered a chance to surrender first, but it was rarely the case that these things went that smoothly. As he and the men who followed him moved through the city of Elgon, going from house to house looking for enemy soldiers, he was constantly dreading that each minute would be his last. Most of the time, they met little resistance. Most of the soldiers seemed to have fled already, no doubt due to the fact that his sister Sylvie was busy taking on the main army just outside the city's walls. Every now and then he'd catch a glimpse of her head, towering above the surrounding buildings, and despite their almost lifelong dislike for one another, Valden was glad she was here. She certainly made his own task a lot easier. Despite that, there were still troops loyal to Argo hiding in the city, and Valden had ample opportunities to see if his combat training had paid off. Almost every soldier he encountered was older and more experienced than he was, but most of them, no matter how loyal to their overlord they may have been, had little desire to be here, while Valden had the greatest desire in the world to save this city, the city of his father, from being ruined. His own troops were just as passionate about defending their homeland, so the young prince had every intention of winning this battle. As they neared the castle on the top of the hill, The enemy forces they encountered grew steadily less and less. Valden began feeling more confident in getting all of this horrid business over with soon. With only the uppermost terraces of the city left to clear, he ordered Commander Ansur to head back downhill, taking with him a portion of his men to help Sylvie with her own battle outside the gate. Not that Sylvie needed any help dealing with an enemy of thumb-sized soldiers. He knew that. But he also knew that his little sister was as inexperienced in battle as he was, and she might have no idea what to do once she's convinced Argo's army to surrender to her, which Valden knew she'd be able to accomplish. In the meantime, he'd make sure that the city itself was safe from any and all invaders. He and the others with him split up and went from one home to the next, making sure all the inhabitants were safe. Thus it happened that Valden, upon entering a small house by himself just outside the castle gates, found himself confronted by 4 of Argo's soldiers. 2 of them were in fact assaulting a young woman, who was screaming and trying to fight back against the men tearing at her clothes. On the floor lay the bodies of an older couple, no doubt the girl's parents. Valden was shocked by what he saw, but he had no time to think about it as the 2 other soldiers came rushing at him simultaneously. He sidestepped behind a chair and kicked it at one of the men, causing him to trip and fall. His companion's sword came down on him, but again, Valden managed to step aside just in time and counterattack. He stabbed the second soldier in the leg, disabling him for the moment, and leapt onto and quickly dispatched the other one who had fallen down as well. Then the remaining 2 let go of the girl they were struggling with, but rather than attack Valden as well, they ran into an adjoining room trying to escape. Valden ran after them without a second thought. Left alone for the moment, the young woman the soldiers had attempted to violate slowly got to her feet. She was still in an extreme state of shock, but she knew she had to escape. She was about to make a run for it when Valden returned from the other room, his sword covered in blood and his face looking very pale. He immediately came to the girl's aid, catching her just as it looked like she was about to collapse, and helped her sit down on a chair. "You're safe now. Don't worry," he told her, trying to sound optimistic, while realizing he had no idea how to console a woman who had just lost her parents and had been almost viciously attacked herself. The one soldier he'd spared was still groaning and crawled towards the door. He was met by 3 of Valden's own soldiers, however, and didn't make it any further than that. 2 of the soldiers then began to remove the bodies from the house, while the 3rd checked the bodies of the man and woman. "Prince Valden, this woman is still breathing," the soldier said, and Valden looked over at him. "She's barely clinging to life, but I think she could still be saved." "Then we have to get her to safety at once," Valden said. "I should come with you, but I can't leave this lady here by herself. She's in a terrible state as well." "We'll take her with us," the man replied. "You should head up onto the castle to make sure Argo is captured. Letting him get away would be a great blow for us." Valden wanted to argue, but he could see that what the man had said made sense. Usually he wouldn't be happy about taking advice from a common soldier, but he knew he was a novice when it comes to situations like this, so he agreed. He helped the young woman to her feet and assured her that everything would be all right, then handed her over to the soldier, who helped her out of the house. The other 2, once they had finished clearing the house of corpses, placed the unmoving body of the girl's mother to an upturned table and carried it off. Valden was left by himself again, but he could see other soldiers still rushing up towards the castle, so he decided to join them and end this once and for all. Unfortunately, it was not to be. Valden and his soldiers swept through the castle without encountering anything more than a token resistance. They found plenty of people locked up in the dungeons or strapped into cruel torture machines that must have been brought there by the enemy, since Valden knew his father would never approve of such devices in his castle. There were also the bodies of victims, several dozen of them, attesting to the cruelty of Argo and his minions. This made Valden feel ill. Each time he entered a room of the castle he had spent much of his childhood in, only to discover it had been used as a room of torture and other unspeakable crimes. His only consolation was that they had arrived in time to prevent even more bloodshed. Even so, he felt it still wasn't enough, and he wished he could have arrived sooner and prevented more death. He also knew that his sisters would share that feeling. But, despite having proven victorious, there was no sign of Argo himself anywhere. The evil instigator of all of this had made his escape. Several of his soldiers who were captured were asked where to he may have fled, but none of them could answer. And Valden felt sure that they didn't know either. Argo seemed to have deserted his own troops without a word of warning, once he'd seen that he was on the losing side. After all of the fighting was over, Valden felt he needed some time to himself. Some of his soldiers were still searching the castle and the city beyond for signs of Argo, but he himself had had enough for one day. He longed for his mother and father's return and wished that they were here to sort all of this out, as they usually did. As he sat on his father's throne in the empty throne room, wishing he knew what to do next, he heard his name being called from outside. He walked over to the window, which looked over the fields outside from atop a high cliff, and found himself looking down at his gigantic little sister. Sylvie was standing at the bottom of the cliff, just outside the city walls, and her head still rose nearly to the level of the castle's lowest floor. She looked up at Valden, and he was shocked by her appearance. Blotches of blood on her face and armor, scratch marks on her neck, arrows stuck in her cheeks, ears, and hair. She had clearly had just as rough a day as he had, despite her obvious advantages in battle. But he knew she had to face a much more formidable field of opponents. She lifted her arm and held her hand just beneath the windowsill, and he hopped into it. For once, the two of them were overjoyed to see one another. Sylvie held her tiny brother close against her chest, and he pressed himself against it, even though from his perspective, he was hugging an enormous steel wall. "I'm so happy you're all right," Sylvie said. "I was so worried you wouldn't come back out of the city alive." "No, I'm still alive. Don't worry. I'm happy to see you too. Even though you look just as terrible." "I feel terrible," she replied. "I just want to lie down and sleep. But first I need a bath, a meal, get rid of these horrible things." She scratched at a handful of arrows stuck in her cheek, but they remained stuck in her skin and she winced in pain. "Hey, let me help you with that," Valden chimed in. "Lie down so I can reach your face, Sylvie. It'll be easier for me to do it than for you." Sylvie agreed and lay down on her back, placing her big brother by the side of her head. Valden immediately began to work on getting the arrows out of her skin. It would be a long and tiresome process, and he doubted that he'd be able to get every single one of them. But at least he'd spare his sister the ordeal of having it all to herself. As he began to remove each arrow as carefully and deliberately as he could, the two of them spoke about their ordeals that day. It had been a terrible day and a terrible battle, but they both knew it could have gone a lot worse, and it was only Belena's quick decision to come to Elgon's aid that had spared the town from an even more terrible predicament. Argo might have escaped, but his return seemed unlikely at the moment. Now that he knew that Vandan's royals were capable of doing to defend their land. All that the two of them wanted to do now was to reunite with their older sister and head home, before the work of rebuilding and cleaning up after the battle, which still lay ahead of them.